Chairman Pavlo, I really appreciate the opportunity to go off and testify on behalf of Senate Bill 826 today. I think what we see here before us, frankly, is something that I first of all have to say thank you also to State Representative Gary Glenn and his staff for pulling together the House version of this bill and what I like to call his extended staff, if you will, because he had people from all over the state working together to come up with that language. We're talking about concerned parents, we're talking about concerned teachers, and they all came together to work on that legislation collaboratively. You know, sometimes it can get kind of frustrating. Sometimes it can appear frustrating, like our legislators aren't listening to us. Well, I'm here to tell you, this is a case of, this is an example of something that was brought up by grassroots citizens on both sides of the political aisle that are just concerned about the direction we're headed in education, and particularly concerned about Common Core standards. So with that being said, I'd like to go in and provide a little bit of an overview of the bill.
Could we have it a little quieter, please, as Senator Colbeck goes through his presentation? Thank you.
I feel like I'm on the Senate floor. In a nutshell, what we're talking about with Senate Bill 826 is the repeal of Common Core standards, which currently we have the English language arts and the math standards adopted here in Michigan. That was adopted back on June 10th and 2010. And we are seeking to replace that with what we like to say is proven pre-Common Core Massachusetts standards and pre-Common Core Massachusetts assessment. Now, I want to start off with the fact that I'm very sensitive to the impact of this proposed legislation on Michigan's education system, and I want to recognize that there is a shared goal here with the Michigan Department of Education in regards to making Michigan a top 10 state regarding academic performance in 10 years. Matter of fact, I'd like to see it even earlier than that, as all of us would. But one thing that they said specifically in their statement, in their mission statement around this initiative, is that they want to use evidence and data to correct course. And that's exactly what I intend to do today in my appeal to get your support for Senate Bill 826. First of all, I want to start off on some key Common Core assertions. And these questions and the answers are coming directly from the Michigan Department of Education frequently asked questions sheet that they have available on their website. First of all, does the Common Core standards lead to a dumbing down of standards across the board? And the statement is that not at all. The Common Core standards have been built from the best and highest state standards in the country, and they're evidence-based, aligned with college and work expectations. By the way, I should also point out that a lot of the folks in Michigan Department of Education, we have a new crew here than what was there back in 2010 when these decisions were being made. But I think this FAQ has been up there for a while. Second of all, are the Common Core standards expected to improve academic achievement? After all, that's what we're all seeking to do. That's the goals of the top 10 and 10. And the statement unequivocally was that the standards will influence the improvement of academic achievement. So we are looking to improve academic achievement as a result of the adoption of Common Core standards. So you were involved in a lot of the testimonies that we had regarding Common Core. Many of you were here. And I was hearing testimony repeatedly around it when we were talking about some big issues, typically around the assessments. And a lot of discussions around the assessments involved discussions around the standards themselves. And I would repeatedly ask, please show me evidence of where these standards lead to higher performance. And I asked, and I asked, and I asked, and I finally got an answer. And it was in regard to something that, oddly enough, remember, we adopted Common Core standards sight unseen with the new standards back in 2010, June 2010. The report that came out was actually a white paper by two Michigan State University professors, and you can see the reference down here. And the evidence for higher performance around Common Core was that I was submitted dealt with this white paper. And one of the conclusions in the white paper was that, unfortunately, determining the relationship between these new standards and achievement will take several years at the very least. So in other words, it was adopted without evidence. It was adopted and implemented without evidence. And if you dig further into the report, the evidence that they did show of some positive correlation, perhaps, between Common Core standards and academic achievement was captured in this graph, and they did a nice little curve fit that suggested that there was a positive correlation when you had more congruence, i.e. your standards in a state were more aligned to Common Core. And so on the abscissa, essentially we had the congruence measure, and then on the y-axis we've got the NAEP performance. So this is 8th grade NAEP performance. And so they decided that they'd draw that little blue line that you see in there, which shows positive correlation. I've gone off and done some stats analysis on all the data points in there and tried to see whether or not this actually has any statistical significance, and it doesn't. Matter of fact, it has about as much significance as a negative correlation, because I could draw that line through a bunch of those dots myself right now and show that that has a negative impact on schools. Well, you know what? The data is actually starting to show the negative correlation, not the positive correlation. That's what I want to go through here. So it gets to the heart of the question, why should we repeal Common Core? All right, let's look at that academic achievement that we were talking about. Right now, we've talked about it in context of the third grade reading bill. We only have 50% of our third graders proficient in third grade reading. That's a concern. When you go into mathematics, you start out around 48.8% are proficient in third grade, and then the longer they stay in the school right now, we're in 11th grade, we're talking about 28.5% proficient. And I truncated this off, but if you look at science and social studies standards, it's even worse than that. Now, we're talking about new science and social studies standards right now. We've adopted new science standards back in November or December of last year. So that's not impacted in this at all. But I do want to highlight the stuff that has been in place, and that is regarding Common Core standards on English language arts and math. Furthermore, the Business Leaders from Michigan put out a report talking about where we stood with fourth grade reading. The trend lines are not good. It talks about our previous performance and highlights that our trend line is south, whereas our peers, or the top 10 average, is doing much better. So Michigan, compared to some other states, is not doing very well. And 38th is not exactly where we want to be as far as top 10 state is concerned. So let's go look over on the math side of the equation. Not much better. We're 37th instead of 38th. And once again, we've got trend lines that are not looking so good, although in fairness, the folks that are in the top 10 average there, we're kind of following a similar trend line on it. Either way, it's not where we want Michigan to be. So why replace our current Common Core standards with the Massachusetts standards? Well, let's look at the actual NAAP performance. So let's first of all look at reading, and let's look at where Massachusetts was performing, both pre-Common Core and afterwards, and look at where Michigan was performing. There's also a Fordham study that goes off and analyzes standards and effectiveness on it, but I'm going to focus on the actual performance. The Fordham study does say similar things here, and we can pull that out in a backup slide if you want to see that. But the fourth grade reading performance shows that Massachusetts' performance in that regard was significantly higher than that of Michigan. And I would submit that there's also evidence to suggest that that was an upward trend on the slope, so students were actually improving prior to the adoption of Common Core standards in the 2010 timeframe. If you want to go on to math, you'll see a similar curve. It's even more pronounced, actually, especially with Massachusetts. And so while the Fordham study actually did rate Michigan standards an A- and Massachusetts standards as a B+, when you actually do look at the performance of the different standards and the different school systems running in accordance with those standards, you see significant more improvement on the Massachusetts side than you do on the Michigan side. So let's take a peek at what's going on in all the other states. Now, originally, only 2 states opted out of Common Core. That was Alaska and Texas. Since then, the trend line has been to get away from it, in many cases, as fast as possible, including one of the major, including the state of Massachusetts right now, and I'd like to point out, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in detail later, but they were held up as a gold standard of education in the country. Their performance was consistently better than all the other states that we had, and they right now, first of all, they've backed out of PARC, which was the national assessment that was supported by the federal government, and also they have a citizen-led initiative, which is pushing for the full repeal of Common Core. Is currently stuck in the courts. Here, we've had an overwhelming support, a groundswell of people supporting it, and if you can see it with the testimony that you'll see here today, and a lot of the folks that are here, maybe not in the front row anymore, but there's a lot of folks here that are upset about this and concerned about the direction we're headed in, and they would like to see a repeal of Common Core here in the state of Michigan as well. So let's go into a little bit of the background on the state of Michigan. So back in 2009, the federal stimulus bill created this Race to the Top program. In 2010, the Fordham Institute rated Michigan standards as a D in English language arts and an A- in math. The Common Core standards for ELA and math was adopted by the Michigan State Board of Education, as I talked about, back in June 2010. Sight unseen on the standards, and they were hoping to obtain Race to the Top funding. That's the reason that the state of Massachusetts, I should add, actually adopted this. They actually got $250 million in Race to the Top funding. Michigan didn't get anything. In our body, in the Senate and the House, there was actually a House Concurrent Resolution 11 that was put forward in October of 2013, and it authorized Michigan Department of Education to implement Common Core for ELA and math. I did not support that resolution, but it did have some stipulations that I thought were very important. We were talking about making sure that all future standards would be presented to the legislature before final board approval. To the best of my knowledge, that wasn't accomplished for the science and social studies standards. That was not done to the best of my knowledge. So I want to make sure that everybody understands that that resolution itself was in many respects non-binding, and it was just a point of reference from the legislature. Now back in the fiscal year 14-15 MDE budget, one of the next things that we were looking into was right now the State Board of Education, again in a partnership with the Smarter Balance Consortium, and so it was a foregone conclusion that we would adopt Smarter Balance as the statewide test and statewide assessment for the state of Michigan. There was modifications put into the budget to make sure that we would retain Michigan's control over that assessment, and thereby blocking the Smarter Balance assessment, and led to what we now refer to as MSTEP. Summer of 2015, State Board of Education proposes new science and social studies standards, and I got together back in December 2015, suggested numerous revisions to both the standards, and it was supported by many of my fellow legislators. In December of 2015, the State Board of Education did adopt the new science standards as written, but we are currently underway in a focus group to discuss what's going on with the social studies standards. So the purpose of this is to highlight that there's a lot of different facets of what we're talking about with Common Core. There's a lot of different activities, and this bill that's before us right now is essentially the culmination of a lot of attempts to try to go off and essentially restore educational excellence in the state of Michigan and promote Michigan control of that education system. So let's scoot over and look at what's going on in Massachusetts. So back in 2010, Fordham Institute rated Massachusetts standards as an A- for the English language arts, significantly better than Michigan's D, and a B+ in math, which is slightly below Michigan's A-. That's why I focused in on the performance figures on NAEP. The Common Core standards for English language arts and math was adopted by the Massachusetts State Board of Education a little bit after Michigan, and they were rewarded with $250 million in Race to the Top funding as a result of that decision. I should note that the president of the Massachusetts Teachers Association had supported the PARCC test, but in 2014, the membership of the Teachers Association elected a new president who had campaigned actively against a high-stakes test. Then we fast forward to November of 2015, the Massachusetts State Board of Education rejects participation in PARCC to pursue a Massachusetts-controlled exam. And just as a summary, only 6 states currently participate in PARCC after an initial slate of 26. And only 15 states participate in the Smarter Balance Assessment Consortium after an initial group of 31 participants. So the trend line is people are straying away from that Common Core standard framework, and I think Michigan would be well served in joining that trend. And then later on, I talked about this already, where there's a citizen-led referendum to reverse the 2010 State Board of Education decision to adopt Common Core. It's currently stalled in a lawsuit, But I should note out that the polls in Massachusetts significantly favor that ballot proposal to repeal Common Core in the state of Massachusetts. So we got a little bit of a changing of, a little bit of a sea change, if you will, at the federal government in regards to education. And it came through the Every Student Succeeds Act, which provides a little bit of flexibility now to the states that wasn't there before. And we had Michael Petrelli from the Fordham Institute testifying, I think it was last week, although all the weeks seem to blend together nowadays. And he provided an outline, and these are 3 statements that were taken from his presentation. And essentially, it highlights that now states have additional flexibility in regards to the incorporation of standards and the requirements associated with that. And more importantly, it kind of severs the ties between the states and a lot of the federal mandates and requirements that are currently, that had previously existed under federal law. So we essentially have cut a lot of the marionette strings, if you will, with the federal government with the passage of the ESSA. So I want to kind of take advantage of that a little bit. And I, in full disclosure, when we started off on the discussion of Common Core, the first time it was brought up to me by one of our concerned citizens and a group of concerned citizens, I wanted to keep an open mind associated with what was going on. I still want to keep an open mind, but I actually started out not in opposition to Common Core. I actually really wanted to hear all the different arguments, and I started keeping a little notebook about how all the different facets of education fit together. And the result of that knitting arrangement, if you will, and I'm an old systems engineer, and I wanted to see how all the pieces fit together effectively, came up with this diagram. And I often describe it as a 5-layer cake of education. And it highlights that it's the standards that drive assessments, which drive curriculum, which drive course materials and lesson plans. The bottom 3 of those are supposed to be, historically, have been in local control land. That's the local school district that takes care of that. That's the local school board. The assessments, well, Department of Education has had a role in that, especially in Michigan over the last decade. And then standards, notably, would typically be done by the State Board of Education. That's why they adopted the standards that they did. Now, keeping that open mind, trying to see how the pieces fit together. I mean, I started out as an engineer saying, hey, wouldn't it make sense if we actually had a common measuring stick across all the different states? So the idea of having a common set of standards across all the different states appealed to me, frankly, at the beginning, because I could keep track of how I'm doing against Alaska or California or Alabama across the board. And I'm competitive by nature, so I like to see how we're performing. But when you start looking at what the what the domino effect is of those standards, that's when things get a little bit more concerning. And I came to the conclusion that when you start off and you look at the standards, and there's a lot of discussion over whether the standards are federal or not and all that kind of stuff, well, that's not as much of what my concern is. My focus is on what happens inside the classroom and what opportunities are we giving kids to succeed and what opportunities are we giving local school boards and local teachers to innovate, to go off and address concerns that we have, like 50% proficiency in student reading for 3rd grade. What latitude are we giving them in that regard? And came to the conclusion that the key area that we need to safeguard is that of the assessments. And and there's a couple different purposes of these assessments, and I want to be upfront about that. One thread, and you see that represented by this dashed line in this diagram, one thread is focused on how are we doing in regards to the high school. The other thread on the right side of the line is the fact that a lot of these assessments are actually used for entrance criteria into many of our colleges and universities. And they, in some ways, they have different purposes. And I want to make sure that we highlight the differences of them. What's happening right now, and something we're going to be careful about, is on that we want to avoid at all costs, from my perspective, because it'll threaten what happens on those bottom 3 areas. We want to guard against a common assessment across the board for everybody, because that leads to a common curriculum for everybody down the road. That is a very concerning, that essentially means that we've got a centralized curriculum, a state-based curriculum, if you will, that drives everything that happens inside our classroom. And I want to make sure that we give latitude to the teachers that train for their education degrees to actually teach with the best methods that they see possible to address the curriculum that their local communities are looking for them to address. So it's important to safeguard that. And so going to this next slide here, which is important to what I'm really trying to do, is make sure that we have a firewall at that assessment level. And what you see in the push inside this bill is, first of all, we're saying we want Michigan control of the standards. That's kind of a given. But we also want Michigan control of that assessment as well. All right, this is fundamentally coming down. The core issue on all this is that of control. Should we have more and more centralized control? Should we have more control from the federal government, from the states? Or should we encourage more and more local control of education? I would like to submit that, a lot of the concerns that people have, and especially teachers have, regarding Common Core is the fact that it seems like we're testing nonstop with all the kids. Well, it's important for people to understand that that testing is an artifact or a result or a direct result of the fact that our classrooms are under essentially remote control. The people that are going off and trying to steer our education system need data. They can't make course corrections without that data, and the way that they get that data is by testing and more testing and more testing. They also get that data with things that many people object to, especially parents, around the longitudinal data system and the collection of data on our students so they can slice and dice the kids by demographic, by religious preference, by socioeconomic status, all the way across the board. So if your philosophy is that of controlling from on top, you need data. And that's why you see a lot of this push for data. When you're sitting there and you're driving education decisions at the local level, you don't need that data because the teacher is working with that kid on a regular basis. That parent is working with the teacher who's working with the kid on a regular basis. That is local control, and that's the beauty of a local education system, is that the decisions are being made about what kids get educated on at the level that is most impacted by those decisions. Most people in our local school districts don't necessarily know who our superintendent is. They don't know who our State Board of Education members are. They certainly don't know who the federal education secretary is or the people working for Arnie Duncan. So there's a lot of folks but you will know the people on your local school board. I've been to quite a few school board meetings, and folks know who they're testifying in front of, and they know them as community members. They see them in the grocery store. They see them at church. And so it's a much more interactive accountability to what our students are learning in the classroom that way. All right, so let's go over the key provisions of Senate Bill 826. On the repeal front, what it does is terminates all areas of federal control of the Michigan education process, and that's consistent with the parameters right now of the ESSA Act that was passed a couple of weeks ago by the federal government. Next, it terminates all college and career readiness standards adopted by the legislature, State Board, Michigan Department of Education. It terminates all plans, programs, activities, and expenditures related to Common Core standards. And it terminates data collection, as I mentioned before, with a provision of HCR 11 that never seems to have gotten adopted. And it also terminates instruction based on Common Core standards. And I can give you testimony from a lot of teachers and kids that can express their frustration with some of the stuff that's in there, but I think we'll leave that for another hearing. What it protects the parents' right to opt out. So there's a lot of provisions right now in legislation around 95% have to be tested in a school. Well, we're explicitly in this legislation protecting a parent's right to opt their student out of testing, standardized testing, statewide assessment. It terminates all areas of federal control. It restores local school district control for the standards and curriculum. So even though we may put out some models in regards to standards and curriculums, it's ultimately leaving that decision of the standards and curriculum to be adopted by the local school board. And it prohibits state from adopting, aligning to, or implementing any other national or multi-state consortium standards from any source. So you can make the case that the National Governors Association, which is now where the Common Core standards reside, would fit that description. You could also fit that description with the Smarter Balance Consortium as well, and the PARC Consortium. It also prohibits state from requiring the use of any assessments aligned with any of these multi-state or national consortium standards from any source. So the actual provisions around adoption is that there's kind of two steps or two stages we're talking about in this. First of all, it's saying, guys, we've seen the results of Common Core. We don't like where we're headed. We need to do something right away. And so immediately the proposal is to adopt the Massachusetts standards, adjusted and tweaked for Michigan-specific content, obviously, especially when it comes to social studies. We don't want to teach the history of Massachusetts to our Michiganders. And then also talk about providing a state assessment based on that Massachusetts assessment. And then no fewer than 5 years down the road, we could look at the adoption of Michigan-specific, Michigan-unique standards and Michigan-unique assessment down the road. I wouldn't be heartbroken if that turned into 10 years, because I do want some of that stability put back into our system. But I think it's important in context of that top 10 and 10 that our current trajectory is not where we need to be headed as a state. So I know there's probably going to be a little pushback on how could we go off and do this. We've been changing things around quite a bit in the state of Michigan for quite a while, and it's going to take a lot of effort to go off and revamp and change around all this stuff. Well, the good news is a lot of this data, because it's going historical, it's not something new that's being developed, is that a lot of this information is already available. Those standards from pre-Common Core standards out in Massachusetts are available online. We've already got a test engine, which means that that's the actual engine with which you insert the actual questions into it. That's already there. We've got MSTEP, that's deployed. We could actually leverage that. We've got content. That means all the test items, unlike some of the pushback I've gotten here in the state of Michigan for publishing test items, the folks in Massachusetts publish all their test items online on a regular basis. So if you want to know what's on the test, what the questions are, and a kid can memorize 10 years of test questions on it, then they should be on Jeopardy, and all that information is sitting up there for their retrieval. And as far as curriculum, they also have curriculum framework that's specified on there. They're not as clear in distinguishing between standards and curriculum there, but essentially if you take the perspective that curriculum is just time-phase standards that actually maps it into the classroom and into a sequence there, that's kind of the status or kind of the approach that's been taken out in the state of Massachusetts. In regards to lesson plan and course materials, I can't find any online evidence associated with that, but I would assume that most of that information is available as well. So, in bottom line, my goal here, is the same as many of your goals, is to restore educational excellence by getting the education decisions back down to the people that are most impacted by the results of those decisions, and I urge your support of Senate Bill 826.
Thank you. Senator Illenberg and then Senator Kniezek.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Colbeck. I have a few questions, and thank you for bringing this up and having this discussion, because I think there's a lot of information here, and the only way that I think this panel and the rest of the body and the general public, will they need to know kind of what's being brought forth today. And so having it in a public way, I think, is a very good thing. One of the things that, I talked to a number of parents and teachers and superintendents and kids, and, there doesn't seem to be a consistent theme as to what Common Core is. So I think if you could kind of, and I will probably ask this question not just with you, but some other folks that are coming up following you, in their opinion, I guess in your opinion, what is Common Core for those that may not know anything about it? Yeah. If I'm going to try to explain it to somebody that knows nothing about it, how would you best define it?
Well, I think it's a very good question. It's where I started out on this whole journey with Common Core, because as I said, I was keeping an open mind early on. I said, if it's just standards, that's one thing. So standards are essentially a requirement spec for education in the state of Michigan. This is what we expect our students to learn when they graduate and get out of our overall school system and graduate to become citizens of our state. So there's a standards element associated with it. And that is something that if you go to the Common Core States Initiative, Standards Initiative website, you can go off and find out what the standards are. There's actually an app that you can get on your phone that'll actually have all the standards that you'd like to look at. So for math and ELA in particular, you can get that app and look at it there. But standards, as I got into with that 5-layer cake, is only part of the equation. Along with Common Core, you notice that there were two basic assessment consortiums that were pulled together, PARC and SBAC. So if you go down to the next layer that's out there, well, if you have new standards, you want to make sure they have some assessments that are aligned with those standards. Well, the proponents of Common Core said, well, we need to prime the pump, if you will, on those assessments, and they put together the PARC and Smarter Balance consortiums. And with funding, I think it's about $350 million worth of funding from the federal government to prime the pump on those two assessments. So while the federal government isn't directly involved with the standards part, except in incentives for No Child Left Behind, for example, it's the federal government is involved in item level control, i.e. question level control out at the assessment level. So that is still part of the Common Core framework, because everything downstream you see of those standards has to align. So when you change something up at the top, and I'll go back into my diagram here, if you change something back at that standards, then everything downstream gets impacted. So the standards themselves are just that little red block up at the top there, but the domino effect that gets impacted down the road, technically all that stuff has to be aligned to Common Core too. Is it specifically Common Core standards? No, not at that point. They're Common Core aligned curriculum, they're Common Core aligned course materials, they're Common Core aligned lesson plans. In many respects, something to keep in mind too is that the folks who put together Common Core, when they put together the standards, they realized that people would be struggling with everything downstream of the standard definition. So they put together what are called resource kits. And a lot of the material that a lot of parents in particular, because they're dealing with it at the course material level, they're dealing with it at the lesson plan level. A lot of the objections that I've heard to Common Core focus primarily around reference documents that have been put out there in context of these resource kits. So when they unveiled the standards, they realized that every school board and every superintendent was immediately going to hit the panic button saying, we got new standards. How the heck am I going to go off and roll this out? I got to now develop a new curriculum. I got to develop a new course materials. I got to develop new lesson plans. And so the folks who proposed Common Core realized that, and they said, don't worry, we got you covered for a small price. We can give you these resource kits and these course materials, these books, these textbooks, and we got you covered. And that's essentially what was proposed. So when you're saying what is Common Core, I would submit Common Core is everything on that diagram. That when you have lesson plans that are aligned with course materials, which are aligned with curriculum, that are aligned with the assessments, which are aligned with the standards, that is all Common Core. But if you actually want to get very legalistic, the standards themselves, the Common Core Standards Initiative, when you get into their classifications around ELA standards and math standards, that technically is what a Common Core standard is. But you can't view that in a vacuum. You have to realize that everything that we're talking about in this diagram has to be connected to it in order for it to remain consistent and executable here in the state. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I may follow up with that, but so we should repeal it because it's too aligned from top to bottom. Is that kind of what your opinion is?
Well, there's a few reasons, but number one, what I'm attempting to make the case here today, the reason to repeal it is that the goals that it set out to achieve, which are improve student performance or achievement, it's not achieving. As a matter of fact, I have evidence that would suggest that we're actually getting worse. And but beyond that, I think that's important from a government control perspective. I actually am very concerned about making sure we have Michigan control of our education system and we don't cede that to a third party. And especially when you start talking about third-party assessments like the College Board, for example, which is now doesn't just govern SAT, but it also governs AP, which finds its way into the curriculum, is driving curriculum on history, on English, on math, across the board on it. When you have one group, especially an unelected group that's unaccountable to anybody, controlling that assessment, they have a de facto control over our curriculum in our schools. And I think that's concerning because we should be aware of that. So I want to make sure that we have Michigan control of all the levers of our education system so that we've got accountable elected representatives that can answer to people and can respond to them when they get frustrated that we're adopting a standard that they're not pleased with, like we're doing and like we're responding to now in Senate Bill 826. That's a response from the people. If people had an issue with what's going on in the AP curriculum and the AP test, who are you going to call?
Okay, let me just fast forward and I'll cut myself off at that point. So in the bill, the word that you used was repeal and replace.
Yeah.
And so you want to replace it with the Massachusetts standards. And just doing a little research here, those standards were put in place back in 2008 and 2009, which is almost 8 years ago.
Yep.
And so actually the social studies standards were released back in 1997. And so if we were to go to the Massachusetts standard, if you use the social studies arena, we're looking at almost 20 years ago, and there's been a lot of history between then and today. And so, if we're gonna repeal, then I want to make sure that it gets replaced, with something that is current, obviously. And I guess the follow up to that question is, the last thing we want to do is implement something, replace something. Say, oh, geez, you know what? We made a mistake. We need to change it 2 years from now, 3 years from now. Because for an educator,
right,
there needs to be, if we're going to stick to a certain standard, then, we should find its way through. And so my focus is to make sure that we have the right replacement in place for that.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'll point out a lot of the content that you're talking about in English language arts and math, that doesn't change a heck of a lot from year over year. I mean, the only thing changing in English is trying to figure out what the new hashtags are, right? And that's something we never had to worry about before. In math, a lot of that information that we have is pretty persistent. I mean, they're inventing new ways of doing math under Common Core, but the actual discipline needed to go off and perform mathematic calculations, that hasn't changed a lot. You've got a point on social studies standards, but I can tell you right now I'm in the middle of that social studies focus group. And when I look at all the different topics that are being addressed on there, there's only one area essentially around current events and current issues that if the standard were simply phrased as saying address current events and how they apply to historical observations that we've had, you've got yourself covered on that. So a lot of this is, I used to be an old engineer, I used to write requirements documents on a regular, there's a lot of art that goes into how you actually write those standards, and I think it's something we should go off and look at and consider, how we actually implement some of the Massachusetts standards here. And there's some room to address your specific concerns around social studies standards in how we actually use the same basic taxonomy and structure that they've got in Massachusetts, but if we need to tweak a word and say current events, not limited to the last, the last decade or whatever, there's ways to go off and address that, and I'd be open to any.
I want to make sure of that, and certainly what I don't want to do is, and just kind of, this is a technical thing, but as we go through this bill, we don't want to hold ourselves to the Massachusetts standard and limit ourselves to what you just mentioned, the previous 20 years of history. So I just want to make sure we're not boxed in, if you will. And so that's a technical thing, and so I know that, we'll probably get more into that as time goes on.
Yeah, makes sense. I agree.
Thank you. I want to move to Senator Kniezek, and we have to wrap up after this. I will read in cards. There are so many cards, many will be put in manually, but I do want to read real quick the people that are here that put in a card to speak, and I start with my district, Carol Seaver. Thank you for making the trip over, wishing to speak in support. Stephanie Huffaker from Homeschoolers in Emily City, Lapeer City, in support. Karen Braun in support. Amanda McMahon from Plymouth in support. Betty Prested and son Cody Prested from Livonia in support. Amy Stewart from Walker, Michigan, supports the bill. Tammy Cologne from Nover. Mary Wood from Warren supports the bill. Jane Wilson from Marshall supports the bill. Tiffany Submessa from Sherwood. Jasmine Early from Sterling Heights supports the bill. Carol Zielinski from Matawan support. Shane Joe from from Waterford supports the bill from the 10th Amendment. And former State Representative Tom McMillan is here, representing himself from Rochester Hills, supports the bill. And in opposition, Steve Best from MDE opposes the bill. Bob Kepchen, Michigan Association of Secondary School Principals, opposes. Lindsay Case Palsrock, Detroit Regional Chamber, opposes. And Dr. Kyle Mayer from Ottawa Area ISD opposes the bill. And we will have further testimony and give you an opportunity to speak. Senator Kniezek, thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And I feel bad because I legitimately like you, Senator Colbeck, and I just tend to disagree with you on almost everything. And certainly this bill is no different. And so,
Well, actually, there's a point of agreement there.
yeah, there you go. And so, I think that the first thing that's interesting for me is, when we talk about the desire for Michigan to have, control over its own destiny, that the solution to Michigan's problem is just copying and pasting someone else's solution by adopting the Massachusetts state standards. And I actually have some of the same concerns that were addressed by Senator Nolenberg about, these are standards that are almost 10 years old. Why would we want to simply just take something that's 10 years old and put it in place here in Michigan? And so in trying to do some of my research on that, I learned that, like the state of Michigan had done, Massachusetts went through this process of analyzing their standards and comparing them to Common Core. And in 2010, when they produced that report, they found that for the math standards in Massachusetts, they were aligned 94% to Common Core. And for the English language arts standards, they were aligned 74% to Common Core. And so I think I'm just struggling to process why we're saying we're opposed to Common Core on one hand, but then we want to adopt standards that are 94% aligned to Common Core.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, there's that royal we, who's the we that we're talking about as far as pursuing that. But Michigan, what I understand, is we were 95% aligned to Common Core, which got me into a lot of serious questions about why do we need a new assessment? Right? Why, we've got 95% of our questions that should be pretty well documented, right? So we got to invent 5% of the questions and go off and align it. But I will submit, the attempt that I've tried to do today is identify the reason why we're talking about adopting new standards on it. It was because of performance. We're talking about we want to have the best for our kids. We've set as a goal, and I support it with the Michigan Department of Education, the idea of being a top 10 state in 10 years. Right now, we're sitting at 38th and 37th. So doing what we're doing right now isn't necessarily going to go off and get there. And I would submit that when you do that, the Detroit Lions, they should be looking at what the New England Patriots are doing from an organization perspective. You go off and try to emulate where it's working, because you can't argue with the performance that I've seen with the Massachusetts standards. That's why I went off and highlighted what was going on with the NAEP standards. So I would submit it is a case where we're going off and looking over the shoulder of our Massachusetts students, if you will, and find out what they're doing on their tests and what they're doing on their standards. But I would submit that the proof is in the performance. I want to be evidence-based. This is something that did not happen when Michigan adopted this in the first place back in 2010. It was not evidence-based decision. It was an opportunity to go off and fish for funds as a result of the 2009 stimulus bill. And I personally want to make sure that we're looking out for the best interests of our kids from a performance perspective. I want Michigan to be the best, and I know you do too. Absolutely. And when we're looking at, and I'll share concerns around social studies standards. Maybe there's this 10-year gap that we've had in there that maybe there's some current events that we could update in it. But I can tell you, as somebody who's reviewed with a fine-tooth comb what the social studies standards are, that is very much the exception, not the rule. And in regards to ELA and math, there ain't a heck of a lot new under the sun there.
So is the concern then, with your permission, Mr. Chair, we're talking about Massachusetts being 94% aligned, Michigan being, I think it's 95% aligned. So if we have this alignment between the two states, but we have such drastically different performance, as you talked about, I would probably point to the fact that I think Massachusetts spends about $3,500 additional per pupil, with the caveat that I don't think money is the only thing, right? Mm-hmm. And so again, I think I'm still struggling to understand why we would want to adopt standards that are so closely aligned to the Common Core when we're supposed to be against Common Core. And you talked about the proficiency piece, and I'm looking at slide 13, and I know it's gone away, but where we're talking about the fourth grade NAEP performance, and we talk about the Common Core standards were adopted in 2010. I think it's important to note the same way that we've had to have so many discussions between the difference of curriculum versus standards, the difference between adoption and implementation. These were adopted in 2010. Implementation is, of course, ongoing. But the reason that I would reject the numbers that follow the 2010 adoption of the Common Core state standards, particularly in the case of Michigan, is that it wasn't until last year where we administered a test, the M-STEP, that was fully aligned with those standards. And so, regardless of what we adopt, when we're not putting the resources behind it to aid our educators in implementing those standards, and we're not testing using a model or a framework based upon those standards, it makes it difficult for me to accept the numbers as demonstrating some level of correlation or causation. And before I turn it back over to you, I'll say again, we do agree on the testing piece. We test our kids far too much. We are too heavily focused on that, and so while we disagree on some things, there's certainly some opportunities for us to stand in alignment together.
Yeah, and I can appreciate that perspective on it. All I know, we've got more data points associated with where we are right now in regards to adoption and rationale to change to a different standard than we did when the State Board of Education back in 2010 first adopted the Common Core standard. I mean, they didn't even know what the standards looked like back then, much less have any data, empirical or otherwise, that would suggest that it would improve student performance. So, and I hear you on that, and I just got to take a look at where we think that trend line might be. And when you take a step back and get outside of Michigan's box just for a second, you look at what's the trend line that you're seeing nationwide, and you're looking at some of the testimonies from some of the people that were involved in the development of Common Core and what they've been saying about this as well. I think it's a concern, and when you look at, in particular, the concern around control over our education future in the state, and when you start consolidating around a single assessment, for example, which leads to a single curriculum, I mean, there's opportunities for both sides of the fence, depending on who's in power at any given time, to go off and redefine what that curriculum is, and we don't want folks to go off and move our kids around on a little pendulum every single time we have a change in authority. So I mean, I share a lot of the same concerns that you have on it. I just think that we do have we have a lot more evidence that suggests that this is a prudent course of action than we did at the time we adopted Common Core.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. There will be more on this.